when we are doing 3%, and that actually is 0.27%, is that what you thought we were actually reviewing statewide?
Tuesday, June 28th, and I'm here with Rick Weible, who has just returned from the South Dakota GOP convention where he had some successes. But I'd like to start at the beginning of the story when Rick got involved in educating folks all around Minnesota about what happened in 2020. So Rick, could you give us a background on what your research was showing in the data from the statewide voter registration system with regard to Minnesota?
So it actually starts a little bit earlier, before the 2020 election. And kind of hearing word in Minnesota that they were considering, and Mr. Simon and attorney Keith Ellison, were looking at trying to send out absentee ballots a la carte. So even though voters across the state of Minnesota weren't requesting an absentee ballot, they were looking at trying to send out ballots for the entire state. And I called an old friend of mine, Andy Seelig, who is head of Minnesota Voter Alliance, and asked him if he had a database and I'd be willing to look at it for free to determine if there's any issues with those addresses within the database. And sure enough, it was stunning to see so many addresses in that database without even a starting house number. And then when we start looking at the college campuses across the state, we actually saw many dorm rooms without even a letter or a dorm number. And then with my son going to South Dakota State University, and he was a resident assistant over at South Dakota, I asked him, what would happen with the mail if it didn't have an apartment number, a suite number, or anything on there? And he just told me, well, we would just put it out on the table in the entryway, and then people can just look for their mail there. Oh, well, that doesn't seem really brilliant. So that means if there was a stack of absentee ballots there, you guys wouldn't secure those? Oh no, we would just leave them out there on the table. That didn't wash well with me. So I continued looking at the data and then produced a report to the Minnesota Voter Alliance, and then they used that to help kind of prevent the a la carte mail-out ballots for the 2020 general election. They were able to successfully prevent that. Then as time went on, it was interesting. There were a couple calls here and there kind of giving me some previews to some data that was out on the internet regarding the calibration of the scanners. And one of those calls came from an old friend that I hadn't heard from in a long time. Little did I know that that would start the journey of a multi-year process. We're almost to the 2-year anniversary of that phone call. And it was Susan Sjogren Smith who had called me regarding some files that she had seen in a link out on the internet, and she wanted me to look at it. So I looked at it, and sure enough, it was source code adjusting the calibration of the scanners, and it was relaxing them so that it wasn't at a current methodology of 1200 DPI or 2400 DPI. It was moving it all the way back to 1990s technology of 75 DPI and lower. And she asked me, what do you theorize that would actually do? I said, well, actually, when you have something that is more precise, it's more accurate. When something is less precise, it's actually has to guess a little bit more. And so therefore, it's possible that they're either going to be missing votes or they're going to overinterpret votes depending on how the person is filling out the ovals within the ballot. And so I said, without a complete study to understand those nuances, it's something that seems to be nefarious, because why would you go away from current technology to go back to an older technology for scanning? And especially that's important when we use technologies like optical character recognition that comes with our scanners and fax and HP printers and Epson printers, that when you scan in a document, it can actually reinterpret that and put it into Word for you. So that's the OCR technology. So today's technology is far better than what it was in the 90s. Back in the 90s when we would do that and try to run those programs, we were literally editing almost every single word just to make sure that it would work. Now it's at such a high success rate that you can literally scan in about 98% of most documents and have to edit very little. So that's how far we've come during that timeline. So, and then a couple months later, I get a call regarding the elections, and kind of, hey, do you have any more database sets? And I had spoken with the Minnesota Voter Alliance to see if they were tracking the elections in 2020, and they did. And they sent over a database. I also had a friend in the legislature, and I asked him for a set of the database, and then also asked a couple other representatives to see if they had a set, and then I would analyze it for free. What was stunning is that as I started getting into conversations with some of the attorneys that were working Minnesota, and also some of the candidates working Minnesota and having questions about their elections, I get that data on November 29th, or just shortly after that. That's the timestamp from the Secretary of State's office. And yet the statewide canvassing board was done on November 24th. So 5 days after the state certified the election, and the Secretary of State produces this data in partnership with all of the counties and cities that are entering in data into the statewide voter registration system, all the histories, I was embarrassed to call the attorneys to tell them, I really can't help you per se, because in essence, I'm missing 38.9% of the data. And when I'm kind of looking at the statutes here, and this is where the attorneys had to help me, and I'm like, I kind of see 3 different timelines here. There's the absentee data that I was expecting to be there, and it's not, because when the statute basically says must immediately be entered in as they receive it, and if the last date would be November 15th, that an absentee ballot could have been possibly processed if they received it on the 10th, had the weekend, and then processed it within the 3 days, the 15th should be the deadline. So between the 15th and the 29th, what's going on? And then you have the standard ballot that somebody comes in and votes on election day, and they would have until December 15th. And we still have all of this data not there. And then you have election day registrations. So somebody that's a brand new voter that could actually vote, they would standardly have until December 15th to get that data in. But if there was a permanent inability for them to get that data in, then they would be extended into something like January 12th. And so with those 3 timelines, and I'm sitting there telling the lawyers, this first part of the law seems to be completely broken. The second part doesn't give me confidence when we have X amount of days already that they should have gotten the data done. And then I'm looking at such a short timeline for them to finish the data. I'm sitting there looking at so many counties going, I don't know if they're actually going to get it done in time. They're going to exceed the December 15th timeline. And we see that post-election, that was true. So many counties, now whether it was due to COVID or staffing issues, whatever, they missed the deadlines. And it even brings into further question, well, wait a minute here. If we have all of these electronic devices, the poll pads, for example, these iPads that you would see, and you're checking in on an iPad, how is it that data isn't immediately getting into the voter histories? Now, post-interview with some of the counties, they will complain and say, or not complain, they'll actually state that, well, we have to go and do our due diligence to compare all those signature cards that were separate and match them up to the poll pads, and then also verify all that. Okay, so did that change any election results whatsoever? We have yet to have a county tell us that it did change the election results, so we've been working with them and advising them, just click the button and get the data in. Stop the waiting. You can still check post, but at least get us, the voters and the candidates, the ability to look at that data so that we can go out and start canvassing to verify and validate the election.
So that's the absentee quite big question that was asked right after the election that came up in the statewide voter registration system.
It is. Over 700,000 absentee ballots weren't in. So when we sit there and we look at that and say, well, must immediately, and you've got a large pool sitting over here that isn't connected, that raises doubts and issues regarding the election, and that's just not acceptable. And so part of our performance improvement plan that we've been talking about with various counties throughout the state of Minnesota is challenging them to tell us what would it take to actually get that data done, all of it done earlier. So we're basically imploring on them that deadline after the election, that's the minimum standard. What standard can the county have that exceeds expectations? So let's try and improve that, because in the 2020 election, what's important is that December 1st was the last day to file an election contest. And so if you're missing so much data, how can you legitimately challenge an election when you don't have all the data to determine who's voted at a P.O. box? That's illegal. Who's dead? Well, that's phenomenal that they voted and they're dead. And who's potentially voted in other states in a timely manner, and who's potentially cast multiple ballots. And so when you have all of these questions surrounding an election and you're unable to validate before a deadline for a court case, it really makes challenging elections tough. And so when the clock runs out and you get the evidence later, it creates a lot of frustrated campaigns.
That's right, because we had Susan Shargan Smith submit a petition with respect to 204 B.44, which it sounds like was basically thrown out without a hearing. That you later then were able to validate all of those concerns within the data.
Yeah, what's amazing is Susan, her filing to the state canvassing board to try and prevent the canvassing, she was so on target. And that was just one piece of the evidence, and there was so many other dystopian things that I kind of laugh about today, because I'm sorry, but she had photographs in there from witnesses out of Dakota County where ballots were not secured. They literally brought them in a purse in Dakota County. There was also the issue where the post-election reviews, there were 5 of them conducted in Dakota County, and one of them was so significantly off that it raised red alarms. And it wasn't until just recently, it took us a year and a half to get all of the evidence to figure out where we were at. And that frustrating piece is that we had an attorney there on site, we call it we now because she's partnering with us today. She was an attorney that lives down there in Dakota County that was witness to the post-election review. And in the later cases, Susan had to sign into her case just in case she became a witness challenging the elections. And so Jane Bowles is that attorney, and that's part of the Kistner case that we see out there, Kistner versus Angie Craig. And so out of that Dakota County, we see the ballots in the purse. We see the dystopian, one of the precincts was 870 ballots missing out of over 1,300 ballots. So that's slightly above the 0.5% required for a post-election review, with 3 more precincts within 2 days. It didn't happen. And so we're seeing all this evidence come across the state of Minnesota, along with other folks across the state saying, this doesn't look right. And we've even conducted with partners up in Crow Wing, where they actually developed their own database, and then since we partnered with them to expand it for the entire state. The team up there, when they started canvassing, they were shocked at the number of people in the doors that they knocked on and said, I didn't vote in the 2020 election. And so they were able to get affidavits. They also were looking at the data, the voter history, and it was remarkable how many people were saying, no, I voted in person, I didn't vote absentee, or other stories of people approaching voting locations and they were told that they had already voted when indeed they didn't. And so Crow Wing, that team up there, collected so many affidavits, and then we kind of started partnering with them as to what should be the next steps. And we suggested you should approach your county and start working with them and raising some of these concerns and amp it up over 5 commissioner meetings and try to do a slow education and be gentle about it and question it. And then it finally came into a culmination where they actually presented a resolution asking their county commissioners to ask Mr. Simon to come in and actually conduct an audit of their election, first primarily looking at those absentee outer envelopes for the signatures. Mr. Simon received, so in a 4-1 motion, that county commission group up in Crow Wing passed it. They sent the letter down to Mr. Simon. Mr. Simon respectfully denied their request. And that doesn't help, because when we talk about election integrity and something so simple, they weren't trying to take a big bite of the apple to look at everything. It was a simple request to start looking at the signature envelopes but then to potentially also recount the election to determine the accuracy. Crow Wing is not that big of a county that this could easily be done in a day. And so it was stunning that Mr. Simon didn't want to look at that evidence, look at the accuracy of that, and plus, you also had another actor out there with frankspeech.com put on by Mike Lindell that basically is identifying that every county in the state of Minnesota had their votes altered. So one thing that would have helped in partnership with Mr. Simon is it would have been great for him to go up there and conduct that forensic review and even potentially ask the legislative auditor's office to go up and conduct that audit and to determine whether or not there was an adjustment in the vote so that we could either prove Mike Lindell's Frank Speech site correct or incorrect. Because I think every county in the state of Minnesota should know that default answer. And the fact that we haven't had a single county in Minnesota curious enough to determine whether or not that's fact or fiction is stunning.
Now, would it be that difficult? Because there are some concerns out there that this would be a lot of work or would take a lot of money, but what would a micro audit look like of, say, an election machine, or if we had cast vote records, a look at that? What are some actual practical steps that we could take to very quickly do a machine audit or do an audit of these signature envelopes?
Okay, so you ask a couple of sub-layer questions there, and I'm going to kind of take them a little bit out of order, so I'm going to try and do the best here. So one of the key phrases that you brought up was a cast vote record. The EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, actually does recommend that all of the tabulators have their cast vote records turned on. But what's happening that we find out in both South Dakota and Minnesota is that the vendors, Dominion, ES&S, and Hart, have turned these options off. And the way that they're turning it off is that is the county wanting to capture an image of every single ballot? Minnesota rightfully is requiring that we keep all of the paper ballots. So the default answer is we'll turn it off because we still have the original source ballot. They're not wrong in that. However, it would be good from an analytics standpoint that if you turn off that default off, it shouldn't turn off the interpretation of the machine on the cast vote records, which is literally, when we talked about the OCR side of that, it would be the ones and zeros interpretation of how the machine interpreted each of those ballots and each of those circles. Those are important for a couple of reasons. One, if you kept the ballots in order, you could, in essence, take those ballots back out, look at the tape, and actually have humans go through and analyze the accuracy of the machines. There is also a couple of other options. When we timed what it would take to count a race of about 1,800 ballots, it takes 34 minutes for two people to sit across the table and count the ballots. So it doesn't take that long, but now if you're taking multiple races all the way down a ballot, sure, it's going to take some work, but I think it's worth it. And so when we talk about elections, I don't think there is any price too high to actually discover accuracy. The elections shouldn't be about speed. It should always be about accuracy. And I think we have to do our due diligence, because I had a person last night call and ask me, what are the three most important things that we need to know? And I said, well, one, we don't know what we don't know. So for example, the functionality of the machines, because the source code is basically stuck into a lock vault of the Secretary of State's office, there is nobody in the state of Minnesota that actually understands how the election systems actually work outside of government. That's stunning. Those of us who are running base operating systems like your Microsoft software, that you run Windows 10 or 11, there are software companies here in Minnesota that actually develop applications to run on that platform, and they have a deep knowledge of how that system interacts with their system, and their source code is sometimes publicly available, that other companies have to work with their software to build on add-on modules. And so there's usually a consortium of professionals that understand some of the basic languages that are going on. This happens, like, for example, with printing companies. Most software companies that have to print to an HP LaserJet, that source code is available so that we understand that printing language of what that printer is going to understand. That's important, and so that's how we create tighter systems. And you also have multiple companies looking at it, that if they find a security issue, they can alert Hewlett-Packard and Microsoft so that they can determine how to come best together to fix those security issues. And sometimes the vendors themselves, the add-on vendors, may actually have the security violation on their side. So like Adobe, when they print PDF files, all of that interplays. And because we have that in such a public domain for most software, we don't in the election side. And that's where it becomes more restrictive. And I think that's actually the wrong way. And we actually see other issues with that, so I'll kind of let that go. But getting back to Secretary Simon, it's disappointing that with all of the evidence that we've brought forward and so many other groups that we've been working with, and it's actually been kind of a treasure. We've been working with the MNGOP, especially some of their subgroups at the BPOU level, Senate districts, county level. We've also been working with patriot groups that have kind of risen up out of recent dynamics, like the Dakota County patriot groups. There's like 3 chapters. Women groups, Republican women, couple of chapters. We've also been working with a new group that's been forming, Restore Minnesota, which is a faith-based organization that's trying to encourage Christians to get involved in politics locally and to kind of bring their faith values into politics. But they also are learning about the election process itself, which is, I actually think, a wonderful step. I think every political organization in Minnesota needs to fundamentally understand the rules of the elections. Susan Smith is exactly right. If you don't understand the law and the administrative rules, how are you going to effectively run an election? If you don't understand how dynamic the election law is, to where fraud can actually be brought in, to how you can be successful in a campaign, there are so many tools that are available that can help you monitor the election, help you succeed as a candidate, but also there are so many avenues that you have to think creatively as where are the paths that fraud can actually happen. And we see that. We see it in the data. Why else would we see X number of dead voters? Why else would we see X number of P.O. box voters? Why else would we see 1,200 duplicate ballots throughout the state in the state of Minnesota? That all comes from the Secretary of State's data.
And so in working with these groups, I've been able to witness you speak in workshops in city councils as well as in county commissions. I'm sensing that is a great place for us to build towards solutions, because a lot of us that have seen how tough it is to understand the details of the machines when the source code's not there, or I've even seen the precinct that you brought forward before the post-election review, 4950 out of West St. Paul, and still seeing that not be resolved. We're looking for what are these solutions. So we'd like to see us go back to hand counting paper ballots and how that's more inexpensive going forward. But tell me a little bit about what you think the role is of county commissions going forward, or town board supervisors going forward in this process of fixing our election systems.
Yeah, and so what's really interesting, it actually took me a while, and Susan was kind of hitting me over the head with this a little bit, is the secrets are in the law, and they really are. So like the party systems, the elections actually follow the same format as the parties. It's a grassroots organization. So the election systems, whenever a new election system is introduced, it's supposed to kind of go through the county. However, down at the local level, they have the ultimate authority to approve and determine whether or not they use an electronic voting system, still maintaining the paper ballots as by state statute, and to also use the electronic poll books as well. That starts out at the local level, but the county will do the overall purchase, and they have the overall approval of what system to use. And so when we look at this kind of multi-tier system starting at the local level, I think it's really incumbent that voters have to be part of that process. And I don't think the process is short term. So this is what's interesting. In Wright County, we've introduced a plan for them to create an election performance improvement plan. And part of that is to make sure that all political parties are part of the process for determining what machines are going to be used, also evaluating the performance of the machines pre and post election, but also making sure that the political parties are part of the balanced ballot boards that are required for absentee balloting. Now, it's by resolution that's set at the county level, but it's also set at the city levels as well. And so when you have these larger cities like a Lakeville, for example, they can by resolution set their absentee ballot board. So it's important that we as parties and individuals understand that that's actually part of the election process. We can't be excluded off of that. It's not exclusive and independent. It's actually part of the overall process, and we can't forget about that. Now, what's interesting is that there was a gentleman in one of the smaller townships that I went and did a speech for, and showing him the statute that they have the responsibility in selecting the equipment. He didn't want to accept it. He didn't want to embrace it. And I had to remind him that just because you didn't see the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit sign doesn't give you carte blanche excuse to not get the ticket from the police officer that pulled you over for going 70. So ignorance is not a way out. It's in the law, and we also have to understand it. So there is more of an education that has to happen to the voters as well as the elected officials that don't understand it. And part of that is when a new election system is put in place, the first time that it's used, pre-election, there's supposed to be 6 weeks of public access to be able to see that election equipment. Their complaint is, well, we don't have employees to basically babysit this thing. Well, that's not my problem. You have a choice. Either get the employee to do it or don't use the equipment. That is the choice. And they're resistant to that. And so stay tuned for where that's going to end up.
Do you see a role for county election officials as well? Because in my calls and conversations with county election officials, we talked about the CVR report. Not all of them are aware of how critical that is, and how through a public data request post-election, that would be really great for everyone to develop some trust again and some transparency, or through that transparency have some verification of the results. So what is the role of election officials going forward?
So the role of election officials is that they actually have a lot of decisions that they're able to make in isolation. And so this is where we kind of have this weird hybrid in Minnesota. Some of the election officials are strictly just employees, and some of those duties are elected officials where they are your county auditor. And so the non-elected one, the employees, they're kind of subservient to the county commissioners, as well as potentially another person that might be an employee that replaces the county auditor, and therefore, because they're not elected, both of them, and so they have no guidance, and so they'll just take the easy way out. Now, yes, take that as criticism, because I think you need to do the next level up. I'm encouraging you to turn on those CVR reports. Now, for the elected officials, it would behoove them to go ahead and turn those on, because otherwise the electorate, when they find this out, may not be happy with your decision. And so at least the electorate has the ability to clean house on those election officials that are not willing to be more transparent. And so I think having those CVR reports is a symptom of being transparent. Not having those, I'm going to let you determine why. You should tell the voters why you don't turn those on. Tell us why you're not going to turn them on to avoid conspiracy theories. Because as soon as you leave them off, those conspiracy theories start. That's not my problem. That's yours.
Mm-hmm. So we're here in the end of June, looking ahead to, at least in Minnesota, we're looking ahead to the primaries coming up in August. Is there anything that that you're paying attention to from the data side, or any other activities that you're focused on ahead of that time?
Actually, I am. There's a couple things that I find interesting. So as we get graduates of high school, and we get people coming into college and kind of settling in during the summer, it's interesting to me to see how many new registered voters. They've just turned 18, that excitement, and it's, for me, I'm kind of seeing a little bit of a downtick on new voters at that 18 to 21 range. That's a little disheartening. I'm hoping more people would get engaged, and I really want to encourage people to register early. So that way when you show up on election day, you don't have to sit there and mess around with trying to register at that point in time. It's But I'm also seeing a shift. There's a lot of people moving in Minnesota. I think there's some economic and political shifts happening in the suburbs and also in the downtown areas. I think COVID has really kind of pushed people in different directions, and so if they have to work at home, I think there's more Minnesotans that are selecting to have more space, for lack of a better term. I'm also seeing a lot of college students not registering yet. I think they're going to register closer to the general election. But I think one of the tips that we do have to look at, though, is that if you are a student who's new into a college environment and you're living in a dorm, you actually shouldn't be voting there at the dorm, because that's not your permanent residence. The permanent residence is back where your parents live, and that's the absentee ballot that you should be requesting. And I would really encourage candidates to speak openly about that, because I think that would actually help more candidates not have their votes in the wrong place, if you will, and get more of those votes back home where they need them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick, thank you so much for your time. Where can we find more about the work you've been doing in the last year, or any of the activities that you're up to now?
You can take a look at some of the work that we've done in both Minnesota and South Dakota at www.midwestswampwatch.com. We also have an email that you can email with any questions or concerns, and if you find any evidence, please alert us at tips@midwestswampwatch.com. So thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
So here's some of the extra credit that you all missed. So when we talk about a post-election review in Minnesota, it's not what you think. So when we say that we're going to hand count 3% of the precincts within a county, but it's only for 3 of the races. So when we look at Sherburne County, and there's literally 264 little voting positions, and we're only looking at about 25 of those little ballot circles, that reduces that we're actually only looking at 9% of that ballot. So when you take that 9% to the 3%, we're barely doing a quarter. It's actually just above a 1/4% of an entire county when you look at the entire election. So we should actually ask ourselves, when we are doing 3%, and that actually is 0.27%, is that what you thought we were actually reviewing statewide? Of course not. Minnesotans have no idea. They think we're actually doing a real study on this. Furthermore, when we looked at Sherburne County and we looked at their post-election review results, and we see that out of the 1,800 votes that were cast in the races, we see 2 errors in one error in each of the 3 elections. So there was 2 out of 3. And when you add up the totals, number of ovals that it actually went through and scanned, it actually exceeded the EAC numbers for what they would consider in testing, and their ruling would be you need to send that machine back for further testing and examination and fixing. And so what's stunning to me is that we sit here and we look at these machines, and we have this one error rate for the post-election review, but we ignore the EAC recommendations and the validity of a machine. And I think that needs to change. It may change a little bit more, because now under current law, going into the 2022 election, is that those thresholds of 0.5% are much more stringent. So it's literally like 2 errors within 1,200. That would trigger another post-election review of 3 more precincts within 2 days. So that's the extra bonus.
And it's interesting because we have Sherburne that you talked about, we have Dakota that you talked about, and I mean, the evidence is really a mountain of evidence at this point if one wants to actually look at it.
Right.
And so it's really cutting through the noise and the propaganda now, 19 months in. Like, you've done the work to look at the data. Right. And so I'm just encouraging everyone out there to have a look at what Rick has done.
Yeah.
And be curious about it, because going forward, this is a serious issue that we know we need to get right.
It is, and I would encourage people to look at what the EAC has. on their actual certificate of conformance for even the new machines. It's quite stunning that even the new machines that the state of Minnesota, or actually the counties, or the state of Minnesota has certified and the counties are purchasing, they're not great. So we see that there is software that is going to expire next year that Microsoft is no longer going to support. We also see other software that is going to expire within 3 years. And so this actually puts us on a trajectory that we have to replace election equipment frequently in order to stay up with some of the technology. But we don't stay up with the technology because some of the modules in there are actually using a Windows Access little module in their runtime piece, and that hasn't been supported in years. And so there's actually security concerns, and Microsoft will tell you directly what happens if I'm not using the latest, greatest software if you're no longer providing support. You are missing security updates that can put your system at risk. Okay, that's kind of important to know. And then when we're using these Linux systems and these little runtime utilities for the tabulators, these are on systems that are using security protocols. They're just absolutely terrible. I'll hopefully start putting out reports on that itself, but just the fact that you can actually take some of those items directly out of the EAC report and just type in that software version and type in end of life, it'll give you the dates right there.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of, that's speaking to the software. So speaking to the hardware, in 2020, in 65 counties, we use the ES&S DS200 tabulator or scanner. Now in Antrim, Michigan, when they did an investigation, they found 4G modems, telet modems inside the chassis in an enclosed area.
Right.
So can you help us understand how would I detect that as an election official? Would it be potentially undetectable if I received the machine from the vendor if I didn't know to check for it?
Well, I'm going to make it, and I'm not slamming election officials. It goes back to that principle of you don't know what you don't know. So unless you actually open up the machine and actually look at the motherboard itself, I'd have to trust you to know what you're looking for on that motherboard to actually see the cellular card installed right on that motherboard inside the system. Now, there are many layers of panels that you're going to have to get through in order to be able to get there. That's going to be frustrating for an election official, so you have to work in partnership with your vendor. In Minnesota, they're using a vendor out of St. Cloud. That's kind of their trusted partner. That vendor should show you and confirm. If you would like to, if you can get your vendor to open up that system and you want to take a picture of it and you want to send it to tips@midwestswampwatch.com, I can identify all those parts that are on that motherboard and at least tell you yay or nay. Now there is another model for the Dominion systems that Dakota County has purchased that is a USB cellular modem that they're going to use after they print 3 tapes at the precinct level, then plug it in and then transmit the data. So we're curious to see how well that works. And unfortunately, and this isn't a slam on anybody, but the reality is it's one more piece of failure that I'm not comfortable with that these election officials have to deal with, because we're trusting them to plug this in and understand how to submit this over the internet. And so I'm not comfortable with the way that they're setting this up. Even the thumb drives themselves are a little bit problematic in that regard, because we see so many thumb drives that were recycled, and that's also kind of a violation of basic election security.
And just to establish your authority, I'll be able to play this back. What happened in 2016 when you were brought the e-poll pads in your town?
So I was the mayor for the city of St. Bonifacius. It was my last year of service, and Hennepin County at this time was selected the test county to basically test out the e-poll books. No Inc. was the company that was brought in to basically kind of provide this test for the Secretary of State in partnership with Hennepin County. What was interesting is when we received these e-poll books, I was able to hack into it fairly fast, and so I wrote an email to, at that time, County Commissioner Jeff Johnson, alerted him to the issue. He passed it on to the IT department. I also alerted Ginny at the time, who was the head election official for Hennepin County. They put pressure on us, well, you should just sign the contract. I'm like, I can't sign this contract because it's complete garbage. You're not making a warranty on the performance of the equipment, the accuracy, and you're not providing support for it if there's a what if scenario. And so our council voted not to use the e-poll pads, and we went back to the paper registrations. And Hennepin County was pretty upset, and it was just like, well, the other 40X cities are signing on to this. I don't care about the other cities. I'm responsible for mine. And there was just no way that we should sign it. And the other issue that voters should actually go check on is look at the statutes. When you look at the statutes for electronic voting equipment, it has all of these checks and thresholds and processes that they have to go through and certifications before it can be used in our election process. The electronic registration systems have none of those requirements. And I think that's important because there's actually a little bit of an open hole directly into the Secretary of State's office that we discovered in 2020 and 2021 that we should not be comfortable with. And so when it comes to election security, we're not there. And these e-poll books give too much information out in real time. And I think all parties should sit down and readjust the absentee balloting process, the way that we conduct elections. I don't believe that we should actually be receiving absentee ballots on the same day that we're actually doing elections. And so we have to have a timeline. So.
If you'd like to do pictures.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Ray.
Yep, thanks. Yep, we're good.